I'll start time if everyone else is ready on my first word. I affirm the resolution resolved. The primary objective of the United States criminal justice system ought to be rehabilitation. The value is justice defined as fairness, and the value criterion is respecting human dignity. Human dignity is a recognition that human beings possess a special value intrinsic to their humanity, and as such are worthy of respect simply because they are humans. This is a prerequisite to any other framework for two reasons. One, individuals who are not themselves respected cannot uphold their obligations. And two, any other framework assumes that all actors involved have a value worthy of respect. After all, if the actors involved aren't worthy of respect, then there is no moral reason to follow through with duties relating to those individuals. Contention 1 is recidivism. Recidivism refers to a convicted criminal reoffending. Regression-based empirical evidence using data from Canadian prisons indicates that rehabilitation programs decrease recidivism. Arbor and others, 23, quote, incarceration impacts criminal behavior due to greater access to criminal networks and by lessening an inmate's capacity to reintegrate into the labor market due to social stigma or capital depletion. Rehabilitation programs decrease the likelihood of reincarceration by 4 percentage points over a 5-year window. Those serving longer sentences are most impacted by the number of programs made available. Rehabilitation programs substantially decrease reincarceration, end quote. Further empirics verify that rehabilitation not only reduces recidivism, but reduces cost. Rand 13, quote, meta-analysis of correctional educational studies suggests that prison education programs are cost-effective, with a $1 investment in prison education reducing incarceration costs by $5. Providing inmates education programs and vocational training keep them from returning to prison and improves their future job prospects. Inmates who participate have 43% lower odds of returning to prison. The estimate is based on studies that carefully account for motivation and other differences between correctional education recipients and non-recipients. End quote. Overcrowding leads to a self-reintroducing cycle of bad conditions, which increases recidivism, leading to further overcrowding. Only a deliberate focus on rehabilitation breaks the loop. Olson and others, 18, quote, overcrowding stimulates more overcrowding by not offering incarcerated people services they need to rehabilitate. Overcrowded prisons are reinforced with unacceptable recidivism rates. The solution is to rehabilitate inmates better and create alternatives to jail time, end quote. The impact is massive. Failure to reduce recidivism and overcrowding through a rehabilitative approach is causing human rights violations on the scale of millions of people in the US. It's fundamentally incompatible with human dignity. The Julian 12, quote, with over 1 million people, the US has the largest prison population. In the 1960s, lawmakers abandoned rehabilitation and encouraged mandatory prison sentences. Consequently, US prisons are overcrowded and leave prisoners to suffer inhumane living conditions. A prison that deprives prisoners of basic sustenance, including adequate medical care, is incompatible with the concept of human dignity and has no place in civilized society, end quote. Contention 2 is respecting dignity. An innate respect for human dignity requires a justice system that focuses on rehabilitation. Clause 12, quote, prisoners should receive rehabilitation because of the innate capacity they have to act morally and rationally. An aspect of dignity is self-control, autonomy, and rationality. Prisons should thus provide rehabilitation to empower prisoners to be more emotionally mature and better problem solvers. Prisoners should also receive rehabilitation based on their inherent worth as human beings. Dismantling the rehabilitative idea will hurt correctional officers by depriving them of a justifying philosophy that gives their work purpose and dignity. It is possible to detach claims of worth that one may have relative to others and ground it in humanity. Rehabilitation provides for the fulfillment of basic human needs, which go beyond mere physical survival. Prisoners should not leave prison in worse conditions than they entered. Rehabilitation counteracts prison's degrading effects, end quote. That's key for 5 reasons. 1, rehabilitation offers prisoners the innate capacity to act morally. 2, rehabilitation offers prisoners the innate capacity to act autonomously. 3, unlike non-rehabilitative prisons, which deny prisoners any sort of dignity, rehabilitation treats prisoners as human beings by asserting that they have value. 4, correctional officers whose goal is rehabilitative in nature have a sense of worth. And finally, 5, rehabilitation ensures that prisoners are not worse off after prison than they were going in. Contention 3 is the ultimate goal. Rehabilitation ought to be the ultimate goal of the criminal justice system for 2 reasons. 1, ideal outcomes. In order to determine the ultimate goal of the criminal justice system, we should look towards what the ideal outcome of a response to crime looks like. The reality is that no matter how secure the prison is, there is always a possibility that someone who wants to commit a crime would. Ideally, the criminal justice system should facilitate the transition from a dangerous offender to a productive member of society who actively chooses not to engage in criminal activity. This process is by definition rehabilitation. And 2, justifiable punishment. In the United States, arbitrary factors undeniably play a role in who commits a crime. The only way the state can justify punishment while respecting the equal basic worth of all is by providing opportunities for ex-offenders to alleviate the impact of these factors to prevent further punishment. Anything short of rehabilitation as a primary objective allows for punishment along arbitrary factors and fails to respect human dignity. For these reasons, I affirm. Thank you. And I am ready for cross-ex.
My judges ready? Then I will begin my time starting now. So starting off on this idea of human dignity. So what gives us our value?
Yeah, so just simply the fact that we are humans. Like, for example, we wouldn't say that a lizard really has the same intrinsic value that a human does.
Okay, perfect. So how do we increase human dignity? Or like how do we measure human dignity?
It's not something that's measured, it's just an inherent value that every human has.
So like your value criterion tells you how you achieve your value. How do you increase human dignity or respect human dignity?
It's not increasing human dignity, it's just respecting.
Okay, how?
Yeah, so like preventing things that disrespect human dignities, that like violate their value as humans. So like making sure people have rights, making sure they have basic necessities, which goes beyond mere physical survival.
So we just care about like upholding people's rights?
I mean, generally speaking, sure.
Alright, so do you think that we care about like why do we care about things like upholding people's rights and justice and morality?
Because everyone has some intrinsic value.
Okay. Are we able to actually pursue those without our autonomy? You talk a lot about the importance.
I mean, autonomy isn't like a binary thing. It's not like you either have autonomy or you don't. It's a sliding scale.
Yeah,
so
okay.
I don't really know how to answer that question.
Okay, I don't know what you mean by that. Okay, first contention, you talk about recidivism.
Yes.
You talk about how it decreases because of rehabilitation, correct?
Correct.
Do you provide a definition of rehabilitation?
No, but I can get you one.
Okay, that's okay. You talk about, like, why is recidivism a good way to measure, like, oh, we are upholding and respecting human dignity?
Yeah, so I would say that if we see recidivism rates are high, that means the criminal justice system is just completely failing because people who were in prison and then left prison go back to prison.
Okay, what's the purpose of punishment?
I mean, I don't think that as the affirmative is advocating for rehabilitation really needs to tell you that.
Okay, but like rehabilitation is like punishment, so what's the purpose?
I mean, I would say rehabilitation isn't really a form of punishment, it's more of taking someone who was a criminal and making
so should we not punish criminals and just like give them rehab instead? Like,
well, I don't think that you really have to like take the two apart. Like rehabilitation, like you are like punishing them by putting them in a place where they're not like able to live amongst their families.
Is it punishment or is it not?
I mean, like I would say that like I guess it could be a form of punishment, sure.
Okay, so what's the purpose of punishment?
I mean, again, I don't think as the app are willing to tell you that, but like the purpose of punishment, I guess, is to like give
talk about, overcrowding prisons, correct?
Yes.
How does app solve?
So, I mean, a couple of different ways. The main way I talk about is recidivism. So, like, if we see that more people are coming back to prisons after they were in, then that's just going to increase mass incarceration, and so we should decrease.
How does that weigh under like respecting human dignity?
Yeah, so that's what I explained to you with the Nigerian 17 evidence, which specifically tells you that prison overcrowding is causing human rights violations on the scale of
actually
billions.
on that, non-adequate medical care, correct? How is that unique to the affirmative?
So rehabilitation allows us to have less people in prisons, which means it's more easier for us to have medical care.
Are we not allowed to have medical care on the negative?
I would say that a world in which you have mass incarcerations on the scale of millions is going to make it so that prisons can't really adequately take care of their prisoners.
Can I have the card that says that?
The like Nigerian card I was talking about?
Yeah, whichever one says what you just said. And then I'll start my prep time this.
Okay, do you want like the carded version or do you want the link to like the source?
I'll read it.
Okay. And I read the green highlight. It's the one right there.
I'll begin my time starting now. I'm going to pause my time. Can I have the card that says that we have solved like overcrowding?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of in the card you just read, but I have another one, I think.
Can I have like the one that says non-adequate medical care?
I don't know if I ever said non-adequate. Oh, I mean, it says it in the card that I just read to you. I just showed you.
Okay. Could I see the part that says that?
Yeah, it's this highlight right here.
Alright, gotcha. Thank you. Starting now. stop that at 24 seconds. And I'm going to resume my prep time starting now. Stop that at 2:52. Are my judges ready? All right, and is my opponent ready?
Yes.
Then I will begin my time starting now. The value is autonomy, defined as the ability to choose your own actions. Autonomy must be the value for two reasons. First, autonomy is the only value that accounts for the subjectivity of morality by allowing each person to pursue what they want. Instead of trying to force a universal conception of morality, autonomy allows each person to pursue what they see as most important. Second, autonomy is a prerequisite to any other value. Regardless if you value happiness or rights or something else, you need autonomy to pursue it. However, autonomy cannot be completely unrestricted. For instance, you cannot have the autonomy to violate others' autonomy. To uphold the value of autonomy while providing the necessary restrictions, the value criterion is upholding Kant's categorical imperative. Kirstein 23 finds that the categorical imperative states, act that you treat humanity always as an end and never merely as a means. Simply put, the categorical imperative gives you the freedom to do what you want so long as you do not impede on the rights of others. A definition of the criminal justice system is provided by Crowder 13, who says that it is the network of government and private agencies intended to manage accused and convicted criminals. Contention 1. Kant's theory of punishment. Kant's theory of punishment relies on the principle of universalization. Universalization means that an action justified for one person is justified for all, while an action prohibited for one person is prohibited for all. This idea is simply a logical extension of the categorical imperative. Since all people have an equal right to autonomy, each person should have the same version of freedom. Thus, Kant's theory of punishment is retributive. The severity of punishment you receive for the crime is equal to the severity of crime that you committed. The logic behind this retributive theory of punishment is that when you commit a crime, you are asserting that this crime is within your freedom to commit. Therefore, you are simultaneously asserting that it is within others' freedom to commit that same crime unto you. Additionally, this punishment must be done for the sole purpose of retribution. The punishment cannot be done with the goal of deterrence or rehabilitation or any other end goal for two reasons. First, punishment is only justified because the person who commits the crime deserves the punishment. The criminal does not deserve any other fate than retributive or equal punishment, regardless of whether that punishment is better or worse for the criminal or for society. Second, punishment that focuses on alternative goals like deterrence or rehabilitation uses the criminal as a mere tool to improve society as a whole, violating the categorical imperative. Now moving on to my opponent's case, starting off with this idea of justice as fairness and human dignity. Remember that he doesn't tell you what human dignity is, like how we respect human dignity. He just says people have inherent worth. How do we tell when we're respecting human dignity? But the second thing is that we don't value anything like justice or human dignity or even morality unless we have autonomy to pursue it first. We all have different conceptions of what morality is. Until we have and are ensured our autonomy, we cannot pursue anything else, making autonomy a prerequisite. But then second, on this idea of recidivism in his first contention, I'm going to start off with this idea that he doesn't really provide you a definition of rehabilitation, and rehabilitation has many gray zones. That's Fosberg 22, which says that when prison authorities provide psychological therapies to prisoners suffering from depression, does that constitute rehabilitation? What if a parole board requires that a paroled sex offender undergoes chemical castration? Is that moral and a form of rehabilitation? What about imprisonment itself? That can also be considered rehabilitation because it gives that offender time to actually reflect. Make my opponent show you why his version of rehabilitation is the best or why the US would uphold it. But then on this idea of recidivism, recidivism is actually not a useful measurement. That's the National Academics of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine 23, which finds that recidivism is an inadequate measurement of success after release from prison. Instead, the report recommends that researchers look towards things like housing, health, social support, and personal well-being that measure interactions with the criminal justice system and with more nuance. But then furthermore, he talks about how he's going to reduce the costs of recidivism. He's going to reduce costs of the criminal justice system because he reduces recidivism. Rehabilitation studies are actually incredibly ineffective here. That's Sarah 21, which shows you that interventions are limited to the short term and have no clear indication for long-term impacts of program participation. The studies that make vigorous efforts to follow up with all participants typically cannot find half or more of the participants. The fragmented U.S. healthcare system, absence of federal mortality data, state-by-state variation in reporting data, and lack of funding for the long-term studies present enormous challenges to conducting researches that follow participants for meaningful periods of time, meaning that we can't really look to his implementation because these studies have major gaps in them. But then furthermore, he talks about how overcrowding is bad and how it's going to worsen on the negative. Remember that he doesn't solve, because to have rehabilitation for any given offender, you have to put them in that system of incarceration. Until he proves that mass incarceration is going to be solved somehow on the affirmative, then he can't access this. But then furthermore, he's talking about this idea of non-adequate medical care. And this entire card that he brings up, I read the card, it's California trying to implement rehabilitation and it didn't work. That led to the non-adequate medical care. So if my opponent wants to tell you that rehab is going to solve all these problems, then why is a rehabilitation implementation creating these problems in the first place? But then, on the second contention, he talks about respecting human dignity. I have one clear response here, is that it is actually unfair. He cannot uphold fairness. And that's for the fact that when you're looking towards whether a criminal, a violent or non-violent offender is to be rehabilitated, it is up to judge discretion, where a judge might see, oh, the violent offender is more likely to be rehabilitated and the effort might work better. So they're going to have a lesser sentence than a non-violent offender who might not be seen as rehabilitated. We have to allow fairness and proportionality, which Kant looks towards first. That respects human dignity most because it means that the severity of crime that you commit is going to be the severity of punishment that you receive. It's fair to everyone. On this third contention about ideal outcomes and arbitrary punishment, It shows that the affirmative cannot solve. This is when we're looking towards like Norway's implementation of rehabilitation or any effective programs, we see that it's going to increase the cost by 300%, leading to public backlash that is going to make rehabilitation implementation effective, according to Signal Group 24. Thank you, and I stand open for prompts.
Is everybody ready to process? Okay, then let's start time now. So on your framing of today's round, we talk about like that as long as you don't hurt, we should treat everyone the same way, or an individual's actions are justified if we can justify those actions on everyone, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so would you say that it's justified to give someone a knife?
So, I mean...
just to give someone, yeah.
If everyone can have a knife, sure, yeah.
Okay, so is it justified to give a baby a knife?
What? I mean, if the baby doesn't do anything with the knife.
Okay, so assuming, it's okay.
I mean, the baby is not really
a
rational actor. We know that babies don't have the ability to reason, so we probably wouldn't give them a knife.
So Kant's theory only applies to those who have ability to reason?
We look towards, increasing the ability to reason.
Okay, so do criminals have the ability to reason?
Yeah. If, for example, if you're looking towards drug offenses, a criminal first goes on drugs, makes the active decision to go on those drugs in the first place, inhibiting their moral reasoning.
So no one ever has mental disorders, which means
mental disorders may be a factor here, but remember that's not even the majority of the criminal justice system. It's not really
okay, so there aren't arbitrary factors that influence people to be more likely to commit crimes.
I mean, that's your burden.
Okay, sure. Let's talk about your value of autonomy.
Yeah.
So you say that autonomy is restricted to some extent. To what extent is it restricted?
By the categorical imperative.
So what does that mean?
That means that you cannot violate the autonomy of others.
Okay, so how can I am standing in this spot right now.
Mm-hmm.
Aren't I violating your autonomy to also stand in this spot right now?
No, not really.
How could you stand where I'm standing right now if I'm standing here?
Again, I'm not actually actively trying to get in the spot that you're standing now. I'm not
sure,
you're not violating my autonomy.
Let's say that you were trying to get into where I am standing right now. Am I violating your autonomy by not moving?
Okay, because I would have to violate your autonomy to do that in the first place, which would constitute a violation of autonomy.
Okay,
right?
fine.
So it'd be violating your autonomy to move you somewhere else.
So is it okay for us to use weapons and force to kill people if those people are actively trying to kill someone else?
Sorry?
If we have terrorists, is it okay to use force against terrorists?
Can you prove that they're trying to kill someone else? Because I think that's
sure. We can clearly see the terrorists are trying to kill someone.
Okay. What was your question?
So say that the terrorists are trying to kill someone. Mm-hmm. Is it justified under your principles for us to stop the terrorists from trying to kill someone using force and violating their autonomy in the process? So it's okay to violate So it's okay to violate someone else's autonomy as long as they're also trying to violate someone's autonomy.
The state, a state would enforce that if someone is violating another person's autonomy, they're going to face the punishment of that.
So does a prison by itself, isn't that violating the autonomy of people who are in the prison?
Again, so when you go to prison, it's because you committed a crime in which you violated autonomy, right? The severity of that crime is going to go back on you, right? You agree that everyone else can take that same act on you. The only thing that we all have equally is time, is our liberty. So our time in prison is proportional to the severity of our crime.
Okay, that's time. I might call for cards later, but for right now, I'll just start prep, and I'll start running prep starting now. Okay. That's fine. Okay, so I'm going to address framework as a whole, and then I will respond to the negative, and then respond to the affirmative. I apologize, my opponent did a great job of covering the flow. I have a lot of arguments to get through, so I might have to go a little fast. I'll try to slow down and clarify things in the 2 a.m. Is everybody ready? Okay. Then, if everyone's ready, let's start time. Now, first on framework, I prefer justice as a value because the criminal justice system is what we're talking about, but also autonomy has no bright line. As we see, like me standing here is violating someone else's autonomy to also stand there, and so it's not clear like to what extent it means that autonomy is violating someone else's. And then on the value criterion, you prefer human dignity because the only reason my opponent even cares about autonomy to begin with is because humans have value. They tell you that I don't define human dignity, but I do. I say it's the value, the intrinsic value that humans have. And by respecting that, we protect things like rights. But then moving on down the flow, on their contentions, specifically on their value criterion of categorical imperatives, basically their entire idea is about how, like, if we treat one person one way, we need to treat everyone that way, but no, that's not true. Like, look at babies, for people who are not rational. We see Goldwell 17 tells us that humans aren't rational, so we can't just assume that they're going to have a ration. It's also based on the idea of proportionality, but Lichtenberg 22, quote, what constitutes proportional punishment? Should we torture the torturer, rape the rapist? If the answer is no, we should refrain because it would degrade the person who would carry out this act or the society that permits it. An alternative view of retributivism is that punishment should be in proportion to crimes, but there is no standard for this appropriate sentence. The view that wrongdoer must be punished no matter what is detached from reality. Sentences are out of proportion to the involvement of people of color in criminal activities. People of color that are subject to a surplus penalty, and clearly proportionality is not a good standard to weigh this by. And that card actually you can use as an overview on their entire case. Their entire case is based on the fact that, like, the punishment should be proportional to the crimes. But again, as I told you, people aren't rational, so we can't use a justification that humans are rational that my opponent uses to say this. And then you can also cross by the Lichtenberg 22 card I tell you. But then also in my contention 3, I talk about how there are arbitrary factors that affect criminals, that the reason they commit crimes in the first place. And I tell you how we can solve for that. They don't contend with the fact that I say that there are systemic factors in the US, and so I don't have to prove that. They dropped it, and so you extend it through. And so moving on to the affirmative side of the flow. So first they say I don't give a definition, they say that I don't have a definition of rehabilitation, but I tell them I can provide one in cross-ex, the action or process of resulting, the process of restoring someone such as a criminal to a useful and constructive place of society. This comes from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. But then on the contention about recidivism, they just talk about how, well, they first talk about how rehab can be a bunch of different things. Like, for example, like imprisonment can be rehab because it's time to reflect, but like the state has to be actively making that criminal no longer a criminal so that they're actually going to conduct the same kind of activities that they did before. And then they talk about how they give up on recidivism itself. They give a bunch of responses. They give this card about how there's inadequate housing and well-being, and that there's all these costs. But my RAND 13 meta-analysis, which is a study that uses multiple different studies, hundreds of studies from the past, all come to the conclusion that we see recidivism decrease when we increase rehabilitation, and it also shows that there's going to be less unemployment, and that's what actually helps with societal welfare. Sure, there might be some costs they can come up with, and they might be able to tell you that recidivism isn't a good metric, but at the end of the day, I'm not linking to recidivism, I'm linking to mass incarceration and the effects that has, so it doesn't really matter if it's a bad metric. But then moving down the flow, they say I don't have any solvency for mass incarceration. I'm not saying I'm completely solving the issue, I'm just saying it's being reduced. And they talk about how California was trying to implement rehabilitation, but in my case it said like it was failing. They weren't actually doing it well. I looked at countries like Norway and Germany and Canada where they actually are doing it well. It's not a good example. In California they essentially weren't doing that. Please call for the evidence there. They essentially dropped my contention 2 on respecting dignity, where one of my warrants is that the innate capacity to act autonomously is something that only rehabilitation allows for. They completely dropped that. That essentially wins the entire round right here because it links to their value. And they dropped all the warrants, which I can explain in my next speech. On contention 3, they basically just say, they just cross-apply their case and talk about how Norway, the cost went up by 300%, but remember the RAND 13 evidence I give, $1 to $5. Clearly rehabilitation actually outweighs the cost of incarceration, and that accounts for it. And then the contention 3, like I said, they just kind of responded by cross-applying. They didn't actually address the warrants, and thus I affirm. Sorry for the speed.
New math. This is 1 minute 8 seconds. resume that starting. Pause my time at 37 seconds, and I'm going to call that humans aren't rational.
Yeah, sure.
And I'll resume that.
Sorry. I'll just look this up during prep time, so I might have to look it up. Oh, here it is.
I'm going to start my time starting now. Pause my time here with this.
Thanks.
I have 4 seconds left. That's in my time. Are my judges ready? Everyone?
Yes.
Alright, so I'm going to go over framework first. I'm going to move down the affirmative side, the negative, and some few other issues. If everyone is ready, I'll begin my time starting now. So on the framework, basically says that human dignity looks towards intrinsic value. Sure, but that doesn't tell us how to measure it. On autonomy, he says there's no right line. The right line is a categorical imperative. He ignores that. I provide that in case. Then he says babies aren't rational, neither are people. He looks up an article that has a tagline saying that people aren't rational. Make him explain the article because I don't think he read it. Furthermore, he talks about how rehabilitative or like retribution is unjust because like torture the torturer, rape the rapist. Again, I provide you in cross-examination the metric by which we go by, right? Everyone has time. We all have liberty, right? So given that we all share that equally, our punishment is going to be proportional to our crime in that we're going to spend more time in jail or have the severity of the crime that we commit is going to be the severity of punishment that we receive. That doesn't have to be that the rapist is raped because that's immoral, right? We look towards the proportionality being on time and the time that you spend in jail. But then furthermore, he talks about like how arbitrary and systemic factors like negate my first contention. We'll respond to that on his side of the flow. Starting off on the first contention on the affirmative, he talks about how his definition of rehabilitation is restoring people to a useful member of society. This is really important in today's round. The reason is because he is reducing people as mere means to an end. He himself wants to value human dignity. He himself wants to value humans' intrinsic worth. And yet he treats them as a tool of society, a tool that's going to improve society. How is it fair to look at a criminal as a mere means to the end of improving society? He doesn't tell you how that respects human worth under his very definition of rehabilitation. But then furthermore, he goes on to talk about how his RAND corporation data has hundreds of studies. But my Hernandez 23 card and my Sarah 21 card shows you that the data from federal bureaus and agencies has major gaps. You can look at 100 different things. You can look at 100 different studies. All of those are going to have major gaps in them. Make him prove that those gaps don't exist because our US government says that they do. But then furthermore, he talks about how he's going to reduce mass incarceration. Make him prove the link there because he still has mass incarceration because people are still in jail. They're just rehabilitating through the process. He doesn't prove to you where the link is there. But then furthermore, he says that like California's rehabilitation wasn't going well. Yeah, like how are we going to solve that? That these rehabilitation implementations don't work. They lead to not adequate medical care. They lead to all these harms that he talks about in case. That's because of a rehabilitation implementation. Make him show you how he's going to implement rehabilitation in a way that's going to work somehow. But then furthermore, he talks about how only rehabilitation solves because of the human dignity, and where I'm telling you that a rehabilitative rehabilitative approach to punishment is unfair, right? The idea here is that when a judge is deciding, oh, is someone more rehabilitative or not, they are basing the punishment off of how rehabilitative a person is, which is not only subjective, but second, it doesn't make the punishment proportional to the crime. Say that there's a violent offender deemed to be more rehabilitative than a non-violent offender, they're going to give the violent offender less time and more rehabilitation than a non-violent offender. Make him prove to you why that's fair. But then, on the third contention, he basically just provides his rand evidence saying that, there's $3 to $5 return. Remember that we're looking towards like the short-term impacts of having a policy in which you increase spending by 3 times as much to implement rehabilitation, that's sticking number 24, and how that's going to actually affect public policy in that it increases the harsh public view of rehabilitation implementation. If it doesn't work, it's going to lead to more harms, more punitive punishment, according to Gold Beam 17. But then he drops that entire point, so just extend that through. And on key voting issues, we're going to start with framework. Framework is most important in today's round because remember that we can't pursue justice, we can't pursue our different conceptions of morality unless we have autonomy first, right? Otherwise, then who dictates what is just? Who dictates what is moral? Is it the government? We should have the ability to do that as ourselves, as members of society. Make sure autonomy is the prerequisite in today's round, because otherwise, who dictates what justice looks like? Who dictates what human dignity looks like? We can only do that ourselves as people. But then second is going to be the purpose of punishment. I asked him in cross-examination, he cannot tell you what the purpose of punishment is. Only the negative does. We can't have a society without punishment because that warrants any individual doing anything they want. Retributive punishment is the only fair method that respects human dignity and the categorical imperative, because it is based on this idea of proportionality, not how rehabilitative a person might seem. And third is going to be that rehabilitation fails. Look at his own examples in case of California trying to implement rehabilitation. If we tried to do it in the United States before and it's not working, it's leading to inadequate medical care, how does he propose that it's going to work somehow? Extend through all of my cards about how we have major gaps in our data on rehabilitation effectiveness. That's Sarah 21 and Hernandez 23. Before he goes up in his next speech talking about how rehabilitation is so great and that it works, it decreases recidivism rates, make him show you how that implementation is going to work when in case he proves to you that it's not going to work. California tried it and it's not going to work. So now, just on it as an underview of the entire round, what we're looking towards is upholding Kant's categorical imperative. It is the only just way to provide punishment and realize the role and the purpose of punishment in today's round. Thank you.
All right, I'll use the remaining 13 seconds starting now.
Okay, that's time. I'm going to make 2 clarifications and then do key voting issues. Is everybody ready? All right, then I'll start now. First, to clarify this California thing, they failed to actually implement rehabilitation. It was never implemented in the first place, so every time they talk about this, it's just not true. But then the second clarification is on rationality. They just say that we shouldn't use my car because I don't explain why. But Judge, they give no reason as to why humans are irrational. I don't think it's that difficult to explain. Like, why do college students go out and just drink beer and then crash into trees? Of course humans are irrational. And also the example of babies I gave you. But with that, let's get into the key voting issues in today's round. The first one is on evidence quality. Judge, I give you RAND 13, which is a meta-analysis that analyzes hundreds of different studies, all coming to the conclusion that rehabilitation significantly reduces recidivism. Sure, they can talk about how recidivism isn't a good metric, but I inevitably end up linking to mass incarceration and human rights violations there. But then secondly, they talk about They bring up all these other studies about how it didn't work, but this is the only empirical and regression-based analysis in the entire round, and so you're going to prefer it over any evidence they can give you. But then, the second key voting issue in today's round is on human worth. Judge, to say that a human being must stay locked up in a prison cell without any capacity to act morally or autonomously is to say they have no value in society. That's completely different from treating them as a mere means to an end. It's not like we're just saying these prisoners are things we're using to help society. No, we're actually saying that they have value to society. Those are two completely different things. It's also incredibly important to note that even if you buy my opponent's entire arguments about the impacts in today's round and about recidivism and costs, even if you buy all of that, you still vote affirmative just because they drop my contention 2, where I talk about how the prisoners to have the capacity to act autonomously it's necessary to have rehabilitation. Because that directly talks about autonomy, their value, you must vote for the affirmative. It doesn't matter what the other impacts are on the round. They completely drop this and you extend it through and make that an entire KVI of its own. But judges, when you're looking at today's round, my opponent gives you a ton of different cards that say a bunch of different things. But at the end of the day, we're talking about the intrinsic value of human beings, which is why my third key voting issue is on the ultimate goal of the justice system. Judge, they don't address to any of the warnings I gave you in my contention 3, which talks about how in an ideal world, we need to look at when rehabilitation works and the actual purpose of it. To say that to take a criminal and make them no longer a criminal. My opponent keeps talking about this proportionality idea, but I read to you evidence in my round that doesn't really adequately go addressed, which specifically tells you that we can't actually define what's proportional response. Like they concede that to rape the rapist is not a just punishment, and so they can't give you any actual way of knowing what's proportional. So at the end of the day, if we don't know what's proportional, the best way to actually preserve the rights and the value that human beings inherently have is to make sure that they have access to opportunities which assign that they even have value in the first place. And for those reasons, I strongly affirm. Thank you.
Once again, congratulations.